All right, hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the tradition of storytelling in the Middle East, and I'm going to also talk about how it's become reinvented in modern times. Primarily, I'm going to focus on the last Hakawati, and that means storyteller. And he happens to be in Damascus, the place actually where I grew up. He's actually one of the last remaining storytellers, the last remaining Hakawatis, who would tell ancient tales like the one of the 1001 Nights that we're reading, and who would also tell other tales that even go before or are before the 1001 Nights, basically tales from classical Arabic poetry. Just a little bit to define storytelling. Now, storytelling isn't only limited to the Middle East. Storytelling is something that's existed in all cultures throughout history. And it comes in different forms. It comes in song, poetry, chants, masks, and so on. So a storyteller and audience usually have like this sort of unique relationship together where they've participated, at least historically. David Leeming in his book, Storytelling Encyclopedia, where he talks about oral cultures around the world, says that our obsession with storytelling is a characteristic of every culture throughout time. And so it's actually one of the hallmarks that transcends cultural boundaries, and it transcends technological boundaries. And so, I mean, if you think about it today, we still watch movies, right? That's all really about storytelling when we are doing that. So in terms of the Middle East, which is where our focus is, right? Storytelling isn't just a popular form art. One way to look at it is that really it's a tradition that's ingrained in Middle Eastern culture, and it's still ingrained in classical Arabic literature. Many modern authors continue to be impacted by this tradition. The 1001 Nights, of course, it took place, like I said, it's in the medieval times, right? And it was primarily narrated orally by many storytellers, as you can see, an example of that image that we have. And the storytellers are Hakawatis. Hakawati is the singular, and Hakawatis is the plural of that. So there were many storytellers. That's why in the tale, although in the frame narrative, the story is told by Shahrazad, right? But we don't really know who the author is. And it's not because the author is anonymous. There were probably multiple authors who were using that frame story of the narrative of Shahrazad to tell other stories. And one of the important things about storytelling, which actually continues to be one of the characteristics that it has today, is that it's very sensitive to the time period in which, and it's sensitive to the socio-political events and happenings of the time, right? And so that's actually, you can say that when the stories are being told, presumably they're there to persuade the Sultan, right, of what's going on. They're there to persuade the Sultan of his abuse of power and authority, right? So it makes a commentary on the socio-political situation without necessarily saying, I'm commenting on the socio-political story. And then it's interesting because you have Shahrazad in the tale who's actually supposedly telling those tales. So you can see how there are many different layers of who's telling the story, and what is the commentary, really of the story really about. So here, the last Hakawati, and this is comes, a lot of the information about him comes from an article written by Dr. Fayyad, who interviewed the Abu Shadi. His name is Abu Shadi, meaning the father of Shadi, and he interviewed him, and he's really one of the last traditional storytellers of that follow the oral tradition and narratives of storytelling. And I had you watch a short clip of him performing and telling, and performing his stories. It was only a 1-minute clip that you could watch. But he continues to tell the stories at Nafura. Now, the interview took place in 2005. That was before the civil war broke out in Syria. And I have a map here of where Syria is located for you to take a look at. But he would tell it in the part of old Damascus, right? And that's a place where people with tourists go to, but it's also a place where you can find, herbs and a lot of things that are related to ancient culture, like rugs, if you wanted to buy traditional rugs, if you wanted to buy traditional herbs that are very fresh. It's not kind of like the market here, farmer's market here, but not exactly, because it has a lot of the old traditions that you would have in Damascus. So it's not like the modern parts of Damascus. And so he begins by telling, the stories with Once Upon a Time. And the reason for that is because of the performative component of it. So oral tradition, the quality of it is a performance. It's based on performance, and that's how he sees it as a theater. And he uses, a lot of body language, and he holds a sword, as you would have seen in the video, as a way to create that performance for audiences. So it's a performative key and when you begin with Once Upon a Time, it helps ignite the imagination of the authors and of the audiences, and takes them onto the journey of what the Hakawati is going to say. Now, you may ask, well, why is the art of storytelling, lost? Why is he the last Hakawati? And partly is the modernization of the world. And so, like I said, in 2005, Damascus had become taken over by the son of the President Hafiz al-Assad, who had ruled for over 30 years. And so what he was trying initially to do before the war broke out was to create a modern Syria that's associated with the West. And so he created this opera house, and he was encouraging more and more of Western art forms. And that, since the 1950s and 60s, he was already storytelling was becoming kind of an extinct art form. And now it became more and more so because it became associated with the poor classes, and this would be with the the opera would become more or less like associated with the bourgeois and the middle upper class, which was actually really growing during, starting to emerge and become more visible during the time of Bashar al-Assad II, the son of the first, of Hafiz al-Assad. And so you can see here the stage and this kind of performance. If you can see the performances, they're very much modern forms. Now, if you go to the Nafura, the old traditional coffee place, it's really not restricted to class, even though storytellers are poor. It's not restricted to class. It's actually open to all social classes. You could be of any social class and you would be welcome. It would be much more inclusive, whereas the more modernized version really excluded the poor. Partly one of the reason where the poor classes were becoming more and more squeezed, that would end up leading to the civil war that continues to go on today. And unfortunately, a huge part of Syria, all of Syria has become destroyed. But to go back to the idea of the Hakawati, in pre-Islamic times, that tradition really existed. It was called the Jahiliyyah. That's like pre-Islamic times, and the Jahiliyyah is kind of like, before people like not, means in Arabic not knowing, right? Being kind of ignorant. The age of ignorance is the literal translation. When Islam came, there was a new generation, though, of Hakawatis that would emerge, and their role was to spread the story of Islam and the Prophet and his messages. Like I said, storytelling is sensitive to the time period, right, to what's going on politically and socially. And so in here in the left-hand side, you have an image of one of the stories that actually continues to be very prevalent in literature, which is the story of Abu Antar, Antara ibn Shaddad. Abu Antar is the character that would emerge as a modern TV show character who would sort of embody the heroic qualities of the original Antara ibn Shaddad. And so he was actually a comic figure, a comic figure. But Antara ibn Shaddad was a story. It was a very long story. It was orally narrated, and it really talked about the heroic qualities of Antara. So like I said, in newer times, Abu Antara became like this sort of reinvention of the original Antara, but you can see he represents the old because he's dressed in more like older terms, and he was like masculine, heroic, had like a lot of values and integrity, as opposed to, that became a show. He was a very popular character, as opposed to the more modernized businessmen who were corrupt and who looked down upon, those kinds of traditions. And those shows, were in the 70s, 80s, and up to the 90s. This character, he was very funny. They used comedy to try and critique newer cultures. But the original tale of Antara ibn Shaddad was much more, had a lot more serious kind of components to it, where it really addressed the issue of slavery, right? And so, and racist attitude, racist attitude that existed in pre-Islamic times, and that the Prophet Muhammad was actually trying to mitigate. Antara bin Shaddad came, his mother was black, that she was a servant, and because of that, he was considered to be of that lower status, because of his mother being black and her being a servant. But he had to learn. He became very learned, and he had a lot of courage, and he was very heroic. And he was in love with Abla. That's like one of the biggest love stories in literature, is his love for Abla. But because she was of a kind of a different tribe who was higher up, he was not allowed to have her. But because of his ability to prove his courage, he would eventually be able to marry her. So as you can see, the tale is really critiquing attitudes of racism. It really impacted the notion of romanticism and love, this idea of unrequited love that actually would be borrowed from Arab culture. And if you're a literature major, you would know about, the knights longing for an unattainable woman who was of a higher social stature, and it was kind of unrequited love because that love couldn't be consummated. That comes from the tradition of Arabic and Middle Eastern classical tales like this, that would become to this whole notion of even, proposal and romantic love that still exists, comes from tales like this in the West, that we see in the West. It was appropriated in the West during medieval times. And so we still have we still see parts of it today. This whole thing of getting on the traditional components of a man getting on his knees to propose, that comes from the notion, from tales like Antara ibn Shaddad and other poets that that included, you know, that the West really got fascinated with that idea and reappropriated it with love. Prior to those kinds of tales and the interaction between those cultures in the, you know, in the West, that whole idea of love and longing and desire wasn't in literature. So the nature of storytelling was really, a lot of it was interactive storytelling. That's how they were told. And so really anything during storytelling can happen. And Abu Shadi, our storyteller in Damascus, he follows the traditional notions of storytelling. So audiences can interrupt his story and talk about unemployment. They can talk about money. They can talk about financial crises. They can interrupt his story and try to get an idea of, well, what was it that was going on? I kind of lost track of that. Could you repeat it? And so what sometimes Abu Shadi will do is he'll move from reading in classical Arabic, reading the tale in classical Arabic, to using the colloquial dialect so that he can better reach his audiences. Sometimes he'll have audiences divided into different groups where one part of the audience will take the side of, you know, the hero, and another part of the audience will take the other side. And then as he's telling the tale, each side would step in to kind of comment and comment on the story, or like sort of exasperate the heroic qualities of, say, Antara, you know, like, no, he was a great heroic poet, he deserved to have the, you know, the love of Habla, it's not fair, things like that. So it just becomes very kind of interactive of things happening. And in a way, it allows the audiences to talk about their how they feel in terms of their own sense of marginalization in society through the stories without really saying it. You know, I didn't get into it, but, you know, there's a lot of censorship in Syria even before the civil war, and so, you know, it's always like, you know the idea. I grew up with the idea that walls have ears. But, you know, so, but if you're talking about a story, right, then you aren't necessarily talking about politics, right? But even with that, I would argue you still have to be pretty careful. But in any case, in the case of Abu Shadi, that dynamic occurs, and audiences can just kind of at least project their own anxieties onto the characters in the story. And so the personality, you can see, of the storyteller is very important, right? Because they have to be able to perform and capture you. And there's been some studies about the storyteller that you know, Aswad claims that the storyteller's personality is very crucial, and he adds or cuts the story to give it new meaning. His instinct is directed by his audience's reactions. For example, he might want to add or cut subplot that address a corrupt judge. His decision to read the subplot or not carries a lot of weight, especially if there's an actual corrupt judge sitting among the audiences, right? So Abu Shadi perceives the storyteller as basically a complete theater. That's in his own words, that he doesn't just narrate but he also acts and improvises while telling the story. So how is the art learned? How is the art of storytelling learned? Well, it's a tradition passed down through a family, and typically the son learns from his father. Abu Shadi taught his son the art of storytelling, but he didn't want him to become a storyteller because he doesn't want him to endure the hardships that he learned. Now, Awashadi learned through the second way of how storytelling is told, and that is by observing other storytellers. And he had observed storytellers during the 1950s and 60s, and they hadn't passed that tradition on to their sons because they didn't want them to be poor. They wanted them to be able to go get jobs, you know, as Syria was becoming more and more modernized, and so they, you know, they didn't want them. They wanted them to go to school and get like normal jobs so they can earn a living. And so consequently, storytellers became extinct. However, in different parts of the world, in different parts of the Middle East, that is, their ancient storytelling is becoming reinvented and reappropriated to fit modern times. And so, as I was actually researching this lecture, Adima Mata is a professor, and she lives in Beirut, which is about an hour away from Damascus. And recently, you've probably heard of the explosions in August 2020, August 15, 2020, that was very much destroyed a huge part of Lebanon again. But in any case, in 2014, she had launched what was called the Cliffhanger Storytelling event, and it would take place in a coffee shop. And they have actually a Facebook. It's called Cliffhangers. And it was kind of sad to see that they had canceled the storytelling events in August because of the explosions that had terrible explosions that had occurred. But she came up with reinventing the story because she grew up in war-torn Lebanon, which we will be addressing later on in the term. She was talking, so she grew up in Lebanon, and her father would be telling stories orally because the electricity would be down most of the time. So she grew up hearing those stories. And actually, you can't really grow up in the Middle East without hearing someone elderly in your family tell the stories. Like when I was growing up, my sister and I would sit around the table with our grandmother. And it's like I can still see her and remember a lot of the storytelling, that she would tell. She would bring us like really good food and snacks, you know, like bread and jam and butter and just different kinds of her delicious foods. And she would start telling us stories. And she always told us stories that weren't, you know, based on Western fairy tales. It was always taking us to those magical worlds where women were empowered, women were refusing to follow social structures, you know, like the story of three sisters, you know, who refused to marry into poverty, except one of them, you know, married someone who was a bread maker, and she's the one that actually had the most satisfying life because she refused to follow social norms and just marry someone who was poor because this man was good to her. Whereas all the other sisters had to figure out a way to get out of, you know, that terrible dilemma that they had. It was always stories like that, which were not like Cinderella stories or Snow White stories. It was really about, I think part of it I grew up being quite rebellious for my generation, and I think it was partly because of those stories my grandmother would tell me. But in any case, Mata, she created this cafe because she said, we need to revive storytelling, but we need to do it in a way that fits our times, right? So she says, it's a new chapter where people's personal stories are given center stage. So she tells stories, but she also lets people come up and tell their own stories. She says people want to be heard, and when you give them a platform, they're just so amazed that people are willing to listen, especially when their voices are so neglected. So here is, let's see, here is a story. Here's a story. You know, like I said, a lot of in Syria, it's been war torn. So there's been a lot of people who left Syria, and one of the girls is going to read a story, 13-year-old, from being in Aleppo. And she came to Lebanon to seek refuge. And so she goes up to tell her story. And so we will listen to that story.
هلا بدي أحكي قصة عن لما بي تعرض حياته للخطر بسوريا. يعني يوم من الأيام it was sunny day مثل العادة يعني كل يوم. قبل 5 سنين بحلب كنا عم نجهز حالنا ونلبس يعني نتأنق مشان نروح نجيب يعني ثياب وأكل، يعني سوق. فلما كنا عم نمشي بالطريق كنا رايحين على السوق، شفت ثياب يعني بتجنن. قلت لها لأمي، نقيت فوق راسها يلا يلا بدي اشتري. فأمي قالت اوكي، ويعني دخلنا على المحل يعني اشتريناه وطلعنا. أمي تذكرت شيء إنه بدها تروح تشتري بقدونس ويعني خس وهيك أشياء للطبخ للسلطة. لما كنا عم نشتري يعني سلطة ليتس، suddenly فجأة القناص من فوق البناية زت على بيي، بس انه بيي عمل هيك بده ياخذ الكيس، يعني راح من ورا وما ضربه. كان هناك في زلمة كان عم يحط اغراض بالسيارة، ضربته براسه للزلمة والزلمة مات، وقع ومات. فكلهم انهربوا، وامي وبيي تخبوا يعني نحن كلياتنا العائلة تخبت ببناية مشان انه ما يصير شيء علينا، القناص ما يضربنا. بعد نص ساعة بعد هديت الجو رحنا على البيت، ويعني بيي كان خايف، بس ما كان خايف على نفسه، كان خايف علينا انه نحن كان القناص كان حيضربنا نحن كمان، بس نحن هربنا دخلنا على البناية. اليوم التالي لما اخذنا الخس ما دفعنا المصاري، يعني من الاكسيدنت هربنا. اليوم الثاني نحن دفعنا للزلمه اللي اخذنا منه الليتس. يعني سالتها بعد ما رجعنا للبيت، قلت لها امي يعني ليش انه دفعتي للزلمه مصاري، ليش رجعتي؟ انه امي قالت لي لانه بالدنيا الثانيه ما في مصاري لندفع له للزلمه. يعني فمن هالوقت انه تعودت انه ما اخذ مصاري من حدا وما ارجع له اياها، لانه بالدنيا الثانيه مثل ما قالت امي ما في مصاري لندفع له. And this is my story.
And so now, so you can imagine here how difficult and what a great outlet this would be for a young child to be able to share her stories and to an audience who cares about listening. So it's almost like a way to write down your personal history, but also in a way, storytelling is a way to release trauma. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. But other people, other storytellers may come up and tell stories differently. Some do poetry. So for example, I'll show you another clip of someone who talks about love across borders as well.
Because they hadn't disappeared or killed him yet. Another is waiting for news for the last 5 years and nothing. Not even a postcard, a pair of socks, a sign of life. In the parallel universe where we live, you have 3G data, and I still beg you to turn the video camera on because I haven't seen your face for months. Facebook wants to remind you that 6 years ago today you were in Damascus holding your camera with the hope of a mother clutching a new baby. I don't remember the last time we laughed from inside. This is not how we were supposed to go. Crowdfunding campaigns for death boat journeys to help Iyad get from Homs to Germany remind me what true love is.
So here, as you heard, what she was saying is Facebook wants to remind you that 6 years ago you were in Damascus holding your camera with the hope of a mother clutching a new baby. I don't remember the last time we laughed from the inside. This isn't how we were supposed to go, right? So this kind of love and longing to be in Damascus, right? And that she's being reminded through Facebook that she was in Damascus 6 years ago, and that, you know, and that she doesn't, you know, she really has invented the tradition of storytelling. And so in a way that, to give children access to storytelling culture and to Arabic, Middle Eastern classical Arabic culture, and as a way to sort of counter this invasiveness of technology that's going on. So let me try to show you a clip of that as well.
Attention nowadays, the preservation of oral traditions like Hakawati is more important than ever.
As you can see, in different parts of the Middle East, there are different ways where storytelling is re-emerging. So I'd like to, so I hope that this kind of gives you an idea of how storytelling, what are the traditions of storytelling, and also how they've become changed with the changing times. So I'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are about storytelling and the changes in storytelling. Which one do you think? Do you think that storytellers should keep the traditional art just as it is, or do you agree with the way that it's being transformed and changed?